So that's great. All right. I see the clock at the bottom roll over. There it is. So I want to welcome everybody in the room and on the screen to the May meeting of the Climate Change, Energy, and Environment Commission, C2E2. This is an open public meeting. It is being recorded. Start with introductions and public comment. I do especially want to welcome our guest speaker, Kate Vesselotz, but we'll do that when we get to her. So anything else before we get started? Okay, then we do have one public comment, I know, but introductions. Let's start the room. Jenna, let's start.
Okay, Jenna Peabody, Air Team.
Mark Greenwood, Commissioner.
David Evans, Commissioner.
Rob Sandowood, Commissioner.
Jim McIntyre, Commissioner and Vice Chair.
Doug Snellenboss, Commissioner.
Trevor Montano, brand new Commissioner.
Yes, welcome.
Elizabeth Whitney, Commissioner.
Kate Vesselotz, guest, Regional Sustainability Manager for Turner Construction.
And I'm Cindy Lewin, Chair. And I do want to mention this is my first meeting as Chair. Joan as Vice Chair. There will be, Joan is so not leaving that we're not going to do a big to-do of thank yous yet because we need her so much. But I do want to acknowledge that Joan is not chairing this meeting. And we really do thank you for all that you've done, but we're not doing anything for it because you're not leaving. So who do we have on the phone?
Demetra.
Demetra McBride, Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management. And we do have a couple of great folks from Stormwater here tonight, too.
My name is Elizabeth Thurber, and I work on the Stormwater Infrastructure team with Demetra.
Thank you. Connor.
Hi, my name is Connor Latender. I'm an Arlington resident and tuning in as a first commission meeting just to learn and observe.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric.
Yeah, excuse me. Hi, I'm Eric Harold. I'm a former member of C2E2, which dates me quite a bit. I'm working on the Civic Federation Stormwater Working Group, and so I'm just here as part of that and as part of the public to observe.
Thank you. Joe.
Hi, Joe Trevette, Commissioner.
Sandy.
Sandy?
Here for the Spout Run Working Group and President of Waverly Hills Civic Association.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I think that is everyone. So with that, we did receive a public comment, and I think that the person submitted it in writing. William Edmister, I don't think is here. So Kate, do you want to read it? Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, we can read it.
Or just summarize it?
So
we can show it.
Yeah,
that would be awesome. So gist of this is about keeping a statute in Arlington ordinance that requires landlords to keep buildings warm through May 1st. And with climate change and changing temperatures, people are getting very hot and struggling, and that we should work on reducing that needless pollution from heating buildings unnecessarily and changing that ordinance.
and I can send this to the group.
I think that would be the best way to share it, rather than because if the ordinance is underneath, it goes on. So we'll send it around. But so that is. Are there any other public comments from anyone?
I'd like to just follow up on that. That's actually a great idea. When I first moved to Arlington many, many years ago, the first time I lived here, I lived in an apartment building with a giant, grand, beautiful entryway. And in the summer, it was cooled so low that the staff had heating units under their desk to keep them warm. I don't know who was demanding that entire giant cubic footage of lobby be cooled to like 66 degrees. Maybe my husband, but if that has anything to do with the code requirements, I think there's definitely something.
Right, yeah, certainly in downtown DC, you see that all the time. I mean, I think temperatures were all, sexism here, but temperatures were all set for men wearing suits. And now nobody goes to work, and when they do, they don't wear suits and ties very often. So you can change the world.
Cindy, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is that note from the public something that C2E2 would like to take up in greater depth, maybe at a future meeting, and C2E2 would decide whether it wants to make a recommendation?
I think we'd love to know more about it.
Okay.
I think we'd love, I think it's important that C2E2 focus. I know, our scope is so huge with the environment. And it's interesting to hear that it was E2C2, now it's C2E2. But I do want to focus, but that seems like sort of a narrow thing that we could actually address if it's really a problem, if it's really happening sufficiently. I don't know enough to know if it is. And I don't know, Demetra, if you'd be able to find that out either.
Yes, air staff can work with our code enforcement official and his office and get more background on that. And maybe come back to C2E2 with more information.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Is there any public comment from anybody on the phone before we move to our guest speaker? Okay, hearing none. Okay, one last moment. Let me introduce Kate Vesselance, who's here in the room with us. Kate is the sustainability manager for DC, Maryland, and Virginia for Turner Construction, which is a huge construction company, as you probably all know. Kate's position was just created a couple of years ago. Kate is the first person to hold it. And I've asked her to talk about, we've heard from a developer, Red Brick, a few months ago that was talking about, how developers decide about sustainability. And I've asked Kate to help educate us on what is the role of the construction company. She has a position. Clearly, she's supposed to influence something or someone. So, and I think there's so many different moving pieces in the process, but this is a huge one, obviously. So why did Turner create this position? And what have you done? How have you justified your existence the last few years?
Instead of guest speaker, I just want to be guest chatter, okay? Because I really like to keep it informal and make it more of a conversation.
Michaela.
Yeah, Cindy and I chatted a little bit and discovered we had a common interest in sustainability, and she invited me to come and speak to you. And I'm happy to talk sustainability to anybody who will listen. About Turner. Turner is a huge international company, and I do have notes here because I want to make sure I get facts and figures correct. We do have over 10,000 employees worldwide, $15 billion of construction per year, 1,500 projects. So it's an enormous company, and it's great that Turner has made a commitment to sustainability because we feel like we can influence the business. About me, I started 7 years ago at Turner as the quality control manager on the new concourse at Reagan National Airport. Before that, I've been in construction for 40 plus years. I have a degree in construction, civil PE, lead GA, and also ISSP sustainability associate. So anyway, I did the quality control on the airport, and then our general manager wanted to create this sustainability position. And I said, all right, I'm in. And neither he nor I really knew what that entailed. So I've been building the plane as I'm flying it. The good news is Turner had done a lot of background work really since the 90s when we were involved in LEED when it first got off the ground. And we've been the leading green building contractor in the US per ENR for 15 plus years now. So we do a lot of LEED projects and some other, passive house and the other certification or building certifications that aren't as well known as LEED. But a few years back, our headquarters leadership said, yeah, it's easy to walk up and do a lead job when somebody else has done all the design work, but that doesn't really reflect so much on us and our operations. So we need to step up. So probably about 8 years ago, they started developing this program. Of course, initially with waste, we've been diverting waste more and more every year. So that is a big thing for us.
Diverting demolition waste or?
All waste. And that in this area, it's not as hard as it is in some areas because, as you may know, there are no C&D landfills, construction demolition landfills around here anymore. They all got filled up. So there are great opportunities to send waste to transfer facilities where they sort them. So it's a relatively easy task up to a certain point in the metro area. When you get out into Virginia, particularly, it's a little more challenging because they still have landfills and they're not doing as much recycling.
So the thing we did was run out of options.
Exactly. But over the past few years, we've put in place a framework that actually became part of our ESG program, which rolled out last year. And the environmental portion, we have commitments to reducing our operational carbon. We are planning to be net zero for our operations by 2030, net zero up and down our supply chain by 2045. And to do that, we are tracking emissions on all of our projects and in all of our business unit offices. So when they put me in this position a couple of years ago, I could see the handwriting on the wall, and we had some tools in place to start tracking. So we've been tracking fuel, water, and electricity on all projects over 20 million in the Mid-Atlantic region for the past 2 years.
What are you using to track?
We have a proprietary in-house program that we use. So we're doing a great job of tracking data. We also have people at the headquarters level who are working networks and learning every week about what opportunities are out there to reduce emissions, to reduce water use, and passing that along to all of our business units. And then people like me pass along to all the projects. We're also looking at resilience. We're working with clients to make sure they're planning for more resilient buildings, and we have some services we can offer. We're also starting to look at biodiversity protection, habitat protection. So as you all know, there is a lot to sustainability. So we're now also training all our staff to understand the metrics that we're using and start showing improvements on every project. Let's see.
Can you go back to some of those things like?
Sure.
Or maybe you're going to develop them further, but like you were talking about things that you're trying to, services you can offer your clients to
Right.
convince them. So like, we want to figure out what incentives we can put out in the market. You're giving your clients incentives.
Yeah. So in the contractor seat, our influence varies based on the type of contract. Obviously, if it's a traditional design bid build, we have to do what's on paper and our influence is limited. But if we can have early involvement by offering pre-construction services, or if it's a design build project, then we can have greater influence. But this brings me to one point that I really wanted to make with everyone is, well, 2 points. One is early contractor involvement is good because we kind of have our fingers on the pulse of what's available and what's going on in the region. And also the value of having a sustainability charrette or a sustainability brainstorming session as early as possible to get the key players at the table. Because I know contractors are concerned about sustainability, developers are, jurisdiction, governments are, but we all have different knowledge levels. We all have different priorities. And sometimes it's hard to coordinate, especially by the time it gets to us. So if we can get everybody in the room as early as possible and have Arlington.
Early, that is.
as soon as there's a design concept, as soon as somebody says, we want to build a building.
An 8-story multifamily.
Right. I think getting everybody in the room and Arlington County saying, these are our priorities. What are your priorities? So we can all know what everybody else is doing and learn from each other. And then make sure that whatever is determined in those meetings gets clearly reflected in the documents, because developers have to make a living, contractors have to make a living. So by the time it gets to our people in the field, they're going to do what's in the documents, you know. Yes, we also have Turner's requirements, and we're going to track fuel, we're going to track water, we're going to track electricity, regardless of what the documents say. But beyond that, we have to compete, you know.
Right.
So when we put the numbers on the paper, we can only go so far beyond what our competitors are doing.
That's just what I was gonna ask, is what your incentives are to do this. Is it like stockholder ESG stuff?
It's a variety of things. Part of it is that we are actually owned by a German company. And so a lot of things that happen in the European Union trickle down to us. And they're also providing a great example for us. So we're kind of following in their footsteps. And then the other thing is just kind of the handwriting on the wall, that we know we have business in California, and our California projects are way ahead of us. Actually, we're way ahead of other parts of the country. So it's, you know, the East and West Coast that kind of are on the front edge of whatever comes down the pike. So yeah, it's just that this is the future. And there are some of us super tree huggers in the organization who keep saying, yeah, and it's the right thing to do. And we're trying to save the planet for your children and grandchildren.
That probably falls low on the list.
So it's balancing all those things. One thing I didn't say in my bio is my father was a biology teacher. So I'm carrying on his legacy. But yeah, it's really important to me. And I have to find ways to present it to different audiences to get their buy-in.
When you have these initial conversations with your client, what do you find to be the easiest thing for them to embrace and the hardest thing for them to embrace?
Of course, it depends on the client.
Sure.
And Cindy had said earlier, she was curious about the different jurisdictions, you know, Virginia versus Maryland versus DC. Well, it varies from county to county and city to city, what their requirements are and what their priorities are. And I think the biggest gap is just knowledge. They say, oh yeah, we want to cut carbon emissions, but they don't know what that means. They don't know really what that looks like. And for example, in Arlington, I know they've been very big on LEED, which I think is fabulous. They're very, very big on reducing building emissions, density, all of that is great. But we're also emitting a lot of carbon during the process of building a building. And there's a lot of embodied carbon in the materials we use. And those are things that have immediate. Yes, the emissions from the building later are going to make a difference, but right now we need to quit emitting so much in our operations and in the materials we use.
That doesn't seem like a hard sell during construction. It sounds like it's a money saver, right? If you're.
Oh, well, yes and no. And it's hard to give straight answers to any of this because, for example, one of the things I'm really pushing for in the Mid-Atlantic region is never using straight generators again. We need to be using hybrid generators with batteries and or parallel generators. So the reason this makes such a huge difference is diesel generators have terrible emissions, right? And typically on a construction project, they say, okay, well, at some point we're going to need X amount. We're going to need this size generator. So they get the biggest generator possible. And when a generator runs, it doesn't care how much power you need. It just runs. And it's emitting constantly. So if you have a hybrid generator, you're running off the battery most of the time. And then when the battery runs down, the generator kicks on, charges up the battery, and then it kicks off again. So there are tremendous carbon savings and money savings but there's a high upfront cost. So I have to sell my teams, yeah, I want you to get this more expensive combination hybrid generator. And they're like, oh, well, it costs twice as much. Yeah, but if you have it for longer than 2 months, you're gonna save money, it's safer, it's cleaner. You know, you don't have to have somebody going out and refilling the diesel as often. So there's never a simple answer, but the technology is out there and we have the ability to analyze it. But again, if our competitors aren't looking at it, it's hard to get our people to look at it too. So I want owners and designers to know, yes, there are things we can do in construction, and we all need to sit down together and come to an agreement about what we're going to do.
How are you getting buy-in on FIAs?
Buy-in from whom?
Whether it's your architects or contractors.
I'll have to call my California projects because they're the ones doing passive out. But that's another thing that's going to be spreading across the country.
Okay, for sure.
Yeah, that's, I mean, this is that early upfront, because I've always gotten the sense is that a lot of the arguments for why they can't do things like put in centralized hot water or even some of the heat pump areas is that they didn't plan for it up front.
Mm-hmm.
And if they had planned for it up front, they could design the building to make sure that they have the space constraints.
Right.
Or maybe they just don't know that the technology out there is gotten better than what they thought it was 5 years ago.
Exactly.
And so, you know, it's how do you break that? Because we just get a lot of pushback is that they don't want to commit to anything but the minimum of energy efficiency. But, you know, again, you can get a huge gains in energy efficiency if you just design it into the project from the beginning.
Exactly.
And then electrification has been, I think we've only had a few projects that have been all electric. But just getting that commitment to, you know, go all electric, because as long as once you commit to fossil fuels, you're committed for a long time.
Right.
And you may have a hard time changing in the future.
Yep. And that parallels what I see in embodied carbon. We can reduce the carbon in concrete. We should reduce the carbon in every project we do. But if it's not in the specifications, contractors are not going to do it just because they're going to do things the way they've always done it.
You also have online Demetra.
Yeah, in that vein, with your experience, what differentiates the developers who come to you already with those kinds of designs? And what kind of value propositions do you think would be persuasive for the ones who do not?
We're going to find out, because we now have a commitment to engage with all clients on a list of sustainability points. We've been kind of nibbling around the edges up to now. And of course, it's a matter of educating our people too. Yes, they have me in the region, and we have some young engineers that I've been educating, but we have a whole purchasing group and a whole estimating group that need to learn the lingo and learn what's out there. And this has had to come down kind of as a mandate from headquarters that yes, everybody's going to learn this. So starting this year, 2024, all of our new clients, we have to sit down with and go through these bullet points of sustainability priorities. What can be convincing? I think like anybody else, it's getting everybody at the table and talking about it and overcoming the financial implications. Everybody always assumes it's going to be more expensive, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But now we've been collecting data, and we have people across the country who can provide information to help with that conversation. And then just overcoming this is the way we've always done it mentality. You know, it's going to take a lot of conversations. I really think there are a lot of people out there who want this to happen, but it's hard to do as an individual. You know, you kind of got to get some critical mass all moving in the same direction.
Those municipalities' requirements make sense. For like in Arlington, it's a negotiation. And the county actually has a bunch of different priorities which tend to seem to compete with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And sustainability doesn't always win.
Yeah.
So how do, what does that play and what's the way to overcome that so that, really people can walk away feeling like they're getting a project that they want?
That's a great question. And in fact, I just took a class at George Mason on the challenge of biodiversity. And for my final paper for the class, I wrote on how do we continue doing urban development and protect and conserve biodiversity, which is a huge challenge. And so I looked at various cities and some are kind of leading the way. And I remember Austin, Texas is kind of hitting it from a lot of different perspectives. They have, education programs in the school. They support community activities. They have local businesses have fun competitions related to sustainability. They have regulations that they enforce on their development. So it's not one thing. It's really raising everybody's awareness. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is if you can make a focus on biodiversity, that kind of brings everything else along with it. And to me, everything we do in sustainability is about biodiversity. That's why we're doing it. Keep the air clean, keep the water clean, try to slow climate change to protect life. So, yeah. So the biodiversity focus, I think, is a really good one. And it engages people. And what they're finding is so many people in cities don't have enough contact with nature. And I think Arlington is good about this. We have good parks, we have good programs to get people out, but it's never enough. Anything we can do to get people with their hands in the dirt or engaging with nature one way or another brings home the importance of what we're trying to do.
So building on Joan's question, do you see jurisdictions competing? I mean, do you, I don't know if the contractor is in early enough in the process, but when they're choosing a site for the building, are they holding it against jurisdictions that are having higher?
I don't know, and I'm not close enough to that piece of it to be sure, but I know that, well, I mentioned earlier, we offer some resilience planning services, and we've had clients who come to us and say, okay, we want to build this building, but we don't know the best place to build it. And we'll do a resilience analysis of different locations, and that will influence them.
Wow.
Because now people are afraid of storms and sea level rise and wildfires. So if we do a resilience analysis, they can pick what they think is the best spot. And I think Arlington has a lot to offer. So I wouldn't be afraid of scaring people away.
Yeah.
So you think, if Arlington really stood and said, this is our vision for the future. We want buildings to be like this. We want nature to be integrated in our built environment. And we want, and we're going to really focus and work with developers that buy into this vision. Is that, because it essentially comes down to almost moral persuasion.
Yes, yes. And I think, and we've talked about this at Turner, it's not that we're not going to do business with other people, but it's that we're going to try to find like-minded people to work with and bring everybody else along.
Yeah, so is this developing into like a new business line? Like you said, there's some developers just put down the plans and say, you guys go build this building, and other developers come and say, you know what, we want to consult with you since you know how to build a building and build it sustainably, and let's have this conversation over the next few months. And is that like a service you don't get paid for, but you just kind of do with them before construction, or is that like a new line of business?
Well, we try to get paid for everything. But yeah, we kind of have a menu and we say, okay, these are things we're going to do anyway. We're going to track our fuel and our water and our electricity, and we're going to divert 80% at least of the waste away from landfills. And we're willing to talk with you about other things. And if you decide you want a full-blown resilience assessment, yeah, you can pay us and we'll do that. So it's not another building avenue per se. We're trying to apply it across all of our businesses. And, you know, we do stadiums and hotels and colleges and data centers. So, yeah, we're trying to bring everybody along.
Insights you can share on how financing and or the cost of capital play into some of these decisions? Because ultimately you could end up with a better, more sustainable building that costs a little bit more, but it seems like the federal government and others are trying to create incentives that lower the cost of capital to finance certain types of projects. Is there anything you can share that you've seen around that?
I haven't seen it personally, but it does come up in conversations, and I know that there are other people in our business unit who are really have their finger on the pulse of what monies are available through legislation and incentive programs.
Yeah. I mean, because the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund should be very nice
Yes.
Form or pocket of capital that should lower the overall cost of capital for the types of projects.
Yep.
Perhaps it's a little early for that. That money hasn't started to flow yet, so it wouldn't be necessarily maybe something that's showing up on your radar yet.
Yeah.
So I want to mention here that we, the agenda, which has capital improvement plan, we're holding the capital improvement plan to next month. So we have a little more time on all of our items here, but hey, do you want to take a minute and look through your?
Yeah, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to hit upon.
Peppering you with questions. So put your mouth. Vendor.
Okay, while you're looking through your notes, I just wanted to know, Demetri, I see your comment. So definitely it dovetails nicely with an outreach program that we are looking to do. And to your point about educating the contractors, the architects, other stakeholders, Paul, our green building incentive program manager, him and we were chatting about a sort of 6-month education workshop where we can, engage with these stakeholders and, talk about the cost barriers. And sometimes that seems to be their first response when they say we're not doing VS, which I believe she mentioned in the for the proposed GVIP upgrade. So we're going to try to get past that and, talk about the, the benefits of implementation. So it's definitely something that we are working on for the near future.
That's right.
Okay, to get more Senate Chancellor.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to say I did look at the what was online about Arlington County's incentives. It looked like heavy on energy optimization, commitment to LEED before 4.1 gold, and the priority credits are great. I was really happy to see the priority credits and the density incentive. And like I said, I think LEED is terrific, but it doesn't address the issues we have right now with embodied carbon and job site carbon. So if there's something that the county can do to talk to developers and talk to contractors and, whether there's a way you can require it or at least have the conversation.
At least put incentives out there, make people think about it.
Right.
Are you doing embodied carbon accounting?
We are.
Working with clients to help track what they're saving.
Yes, so we're doing, as a business standard, we're doing upfront embodied carbon cradle to gate. Because that's the thing we can control. Which materials are we buying? What materials can we compare to each other? We can do a life cycle assessment as well, but we don't do that. We've been doing this upfront assessment for the past couple of years to establish a baseline and learn as much as we could about where we can have the greatest impact. And of course, it's concrete and steel. And this year, every business unit is required to do embodied carbon accounting for concrete, steel, asphalt, wood, and glass on at least 2 projects. So we'll be doing 2 in Virginia and 2 in Maryland. And it's a great learning experience for us. And then we can take that information, back to our trade partners, and we're in conversations right now with concrete suppliers saying, okay, how much can you reduce embodied carbon? 20%. And some of them say, yeah, we can do 20% at no extra cost. So let's do it, you know, or we can probably get to 30% and it's a minor cost. And to me, we all kind of need to put our money where our mouth is. And if we need to pay a little more, then let's do it. Let's push the industry. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, Kate, so I don't know much about construction, but I know concrete takes a whole bunch of concrete to heat it enough to
Yep.
make concrete. There is a thing called low carbon concrete.
Yes.
Is that getting any market penetration? I mean, is that being adopted anywhere? Or is
Yes. So a quick carbon and concrete lesson. As you mentioned, the reason that concrete is so high carbon is because of the heat it takes for the cement to convert the limestone into cement. So anything we can do to reduce the amount of cement and concrete without making it weaker, that's what we need to do. So there are supplementary cementitious materials that put in the mix to reduce the amount of cement. And there are probably 8 different potential supplementary materials. Fly ash we've been using for 25 years probably. And slag and pozzolans, various ingredients that they can add. And what ingredients they choose kind of depend on what part of the country, what's available. But the concrete industry is really pushing the envelope on this and finding new supplementary materials and finding new ways to make concrete. And then the other thing that we have to look at is let's not over design our buildings. Almost every building I've ever built is over designed, more concrete than you need, more steel than you need. So we just need to look at designing smarter and thinking about it during the design.
Right, so that's excellent. Didn't quite answer my question. I mean, very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Is there
yes,
any market penetration?
Yes.
Is anybody doing this?
yes, they're doing it all over the Mid-Atlantic. It's available.
I think we have time for one or, sorry, Doug, you're not done.
Yeah, it is available, but we have to ask for it. Because you can reduce the carbon 15 to 20% without additional cost, the carbon in concrete. If you want to get to 30%, 40%, then it's going to cost a little more. But what we encourage owners to do is in the request for proposal, give us a little spreadsheet that says, okay, what are your mixes for your footings, your slabs, your beams? What's your global warming potential of those mixes? What's the cost if we reduce it 10%, 20%, 30%, so that we can give you that information up front. And then the concrete suppliers know they're competing with each other. So you're going to get the best offer by asking for it up front.
We have time for just one or two more questions.
Mitra has been waiting patiently.
Okay, Mitra, sorry, we're all looking at Kate, we're looking away from.
No, that's okay. No. This has all been really fascinating. I'm curious because the way you're describing embodied carbon suggests that you're talking about it all for new design and construction. And I was just wondering if you're also adopting certain practices for redevelopment, repositioning existing buildings, and adaptive reuse.
Absolutely. That is one of our commitments. And I'm so glad you asked that because the lowest carbon building is the one you don't build.
Right.
So, and for example, we're now working on the AIA headquarters renovation in DC. And that is probably the first net zero major renovation in the country. Because it's the AIA headquarters, so they decided. The
Architects.
American
Architects, yeah.
They must be a fun client, not picky at all.
Yeah, well, they do tend to drag their feet a little bit, but yeah, it's a building that there was no reason to tear it down except that it needed a lot of work. And so they found an architect and some engineers to figure out, okay, how can we electrify this building and minimize the new materials that we bring in. So yes, we are all about renovation and restoration.
If we could, if there was just a source that you had where we could get information that's available to the public on really the approach and the strategy and what they're doing with that AIA building, we would love to have that info.
Absolutely. I was actually on a panel at Greenbuild last year where we did a presentation on it, and I imagine I can get their permission to share it with you.
Because we did add to this draft proposal, our GBIP is less of an update than a complete overhaul. For the first time, we added existing buildings and adaptive reuse to it, so.
That's great.
All right, I think with that, did you join me in thanking Kate? I think I'm glad you did that as a chat instead of a presentation. I think it was great.
Thank you.
So we really, super helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. This is really, I hope it's a conversation we can continue.
Absolutely. Me too.
So you are welcome to stay. You're welcome to go. We are going to our next thing, which I think Dimitri is presenting, is the famed ramp, which I think is here to see specifically risk assessment and management.
Hey, Jenna, is it possible that I can share my screen just because in order to run the video, I've got to have the PowerPoint, I believe.
That sounds great.
So let me just see if I have the, aha. Is everyone seeing that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, slide 1.
Right. I just want to announce up front that, you know, this is going to be breezy. It's going to probably from time to time be a little dense and elusive. This has been, as people who have been working on it or watching it, like Mark Greenwood for a long time, and Eric Harold on the phone, and John Ford. This has been a 4-year, just very, very dense, very technical, but necessary exercise. So, you know, if you want to talk about this in further depth at some future time, if you want me to stop and ask, you know, clarifying questions, please do. I'm happy that I have Liz Thurber on the phone with us tonight. She was being humble. She's actually the lead engineer, the supervising engineer on the stormwater program. So some of this is fairly technical in the engineering department as well. So you are the first ones to receive the first, you know, we did a kind of pre-completion review for the CIFED last November. This is going to be, I'm happy to say, the first post-completion. We have completed the ramp. I'll go through the component parts soon, but this is something that is done after 4 years, and we will be having briefings with the county manager and the board. This is a little bit different because we're not going to ask the board to adopt or accept it. This is a technical manual in many, many parts. And so a lot of this will be executed administratively. So with that, I'm going to move to, I'm not going to go through the agenda. You know, what brought us here was you did have a cycle in 2017, 2018, and 2019, 3 years in a row where you had escalating numbers of storms of great frequency and increasing intensity. You can say, well, we haven't had something like that since, and that's true. But as we all well know, in dealing with climate is all about cycles. So we've had probably around 4 or 5 years, certainly of relatively moderate seasons, but we know that this too will end, and there probably will be another cluster of 2 to 3 years where you will have these intense storms. You will have more frequent storms in each season, and you may have an intensity that is, you know, more superlative than what you've seen in the past. You can see from these photographs here that what we had, where we had water rescues, but we had damage and destruction to property, to businesses, cars lost, and over here on the far right, we had also a lot of civic infrastructure that was destroyed. So what does this mean? This is from July of 2019. I'm just taking a moment to point out this is a bridge in the background that you see, and that is a major travel way for cars. This was 4 Mile Run. 4 Mile Run overtopped its banks. And that meant that it had to rise probably around approximately 15 feet in less than an hour. You had major watersheds above it that were overflowing and pouring into this, and it was just this confluence. But you can see here where you did have infrastructure, you had danger to travelways, and you also had living quarters that were not far from the banks as well. And this is what it means when you have a system that is over capacity, or it is not able, the intensity and the volume and the energy of the water that needs to come into the system is exceeding the ability of the system itself to even direct water into the system, or it's exceeding the ability of the system to contain and convey it. And this is what you get when that happens. And this happened in several different areas and several different watersheds, again, in Arlington. So in addition to those obvious impacts that you've seen, there are also cascading impacts, and this isn't all of them, but these are just some of them that we did address and map out into the scope of the ramp early on and address throughout the ramp in either the full report and in greater specificity in the technical reports and memoranda that are in the appendices to it. These are environmental and cascading risks. This goes into economic disruption. You have property loss, supply chain disruption, economic activity interruption for those of you who live or shop in the Westover district, commercial district. You know that there was significant flooding and damage to businesses there. This impacts your insurance, reinsurance, and insurance markets. That also impacts bonding and cost of debt. This was something that came to my attention when I first did a major 9-sector adaptation and resilience protocol in Northern California, and that was over 10 years ago. And insurance agencies and FEMA were telling me that if people think insurance and FEMA is going to take care of everything, they're wrong. And they also just gave me a hint, a kind of a crystal ball into how this is going to affect the cost of debt and bonding. And here we are. That was in 2011, and here we are in 2024. And for the past 2 years, I can tell you that Moody's and Standard & Poor's, each year when they've come in to have their annual meeting with the county managers and the finance department has asked me to do 2 slides on our risk mitigation and our risk planning, as well as our capital programs. They're not interested in knowing whether jurisdictions are simply planning, but they want them to be executing. So you have this physical damage. You obviously have, a jeopardy to health and public safety, and you have the possibility of population displacement, which in underserved areas and disadvantaged communities or DACs has different dimensions. So with that, with the experience, and Liz having been with the program for a long time and really seen these cycles of the intense flooding, we realized that we couldn't just continue a conventional approach to stormwater, particularly when it comes to flood mitigation, but we had to pivot very, very quickly to a full resiliency type of portfolio and set of strategies. So you'll see here, and I'm not going to read them, but you can see that we started mapping out all the different requirements and all the different new strategies and approaches that we would need to be taking, and we built those as well into the issue of the ramp. This is a very, very kind of clipped description of the ramp, our developmental framework. As you can tell, we had to start off with what are our goals, what are our climate scenarios, and what tools do we need. We had to identify our vulnerabilities, and we did a number of vulnerability assessments. Those are really assessments that look at, for example, your core civic assets and facilities, and are they vulnerable, and what does that mean, and what is your ability to either harden those assets against flood vulnerability and or recover quickly from intense floods. And then there are the risk analyses. The risk analyses have always been my favorite part of projects like this, because what a risk analysis is, it is incredibly dense, it is incredibly technical, but the bottom line is it just calculates what is the cost of inaction. What if you do nothing? What if you do business as usual? What does that mean in 2040? What does that mean in 2070? And what does that mean in 2100? And then from there to build your adaptation strategies, and not just to build the adaptation strategies. And you'll see there's a split, general split between projects and strategies. If you're talking about capital projects that are either projects of conveyance, where you're trying to amplify the capacity of the system itself, and what they call storage. And storage is really what you've seen at the Cardinal School, with a very, very significant size. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, in the Mid-Atlantic coastal region. The detention vault, which is going to take in water, detain it for a period of time, and then has controls to release it in a slower, more controlled fashion. And then, of course, we added programmatic strategies as well to the scope of the ramp. Prior to the ramp, just letting you know what was mainly in use. It wasn't that the county hadn't done anything or that other jurisdictions weren't doing it. The common tool to be used was Atlas 14. It's developed by NOAA. It's a widely, nationally used NOAA tool. The one thing that really fell short for us using just Atlas 14 again is that Atlas 14, first of all, hadn't been updated in over a decade. But more importantly, it's a tool that's based on historical data and present trends. So it didn't take into account what your future climate calculations and predictions, projections would be. So the ramp extends beyond that. It goes into our climate projections. You've heard me mention in the last slide, 2040, 2070, and 2100. We used an RCP of 8.5. This is actually looking at, and this was a decision that we made 4 years ago, to really be, I think, a little bit more cynical about what we expected in terms of climate action and mitigating worldwide emissions. And we felt that this was probably, that emissions were going to speed up and accelerate and be larger earlier rather than later. And that mitigation and suppression and reduction of those emissions, as well as their impacts, was going to probably take a slower amount of time. So RCP is just assuming that there's going to be less progress and less emissions reductions, and then there's a forcing mechanism. And we did say, well, let's use moderate forcing on that, and you'll see what the comparison is in a later slide on that. We looked at inland flooding, sea level rise, and storm surge. Sea level rise and storm surge are thankfully targeted vulnerable areas for us at the bottom of 4 Mile Run, unlike our friends next door in Alexandria that have a very low lying, very long coastal exposure. And we did add present and future 2D flood mapping within the key watersheds identified as flood vulnerable. Sorry, let me. These are watersheds, and I would ask that we focus on those in green. These were the ones that were the most intensively analyzed in the ramp, although there are earlier capacity studies that were done on these in the yellow, so the ramp certainly reflects those. I just want to add that we started off with a lesser number. Once we got the climate projections and those showed inundation maps and vulnerability that we had not before that time been aware of in the southern part of the county, particularly in Roach's Run. So we added on, we did a change order to add those additional watersheds so we can include them in the full analyses. So our climate scenarios for modeling are based on climate change, the sea level rise, and the storm surge, these inland flooding, which is our primary issue here. So you have the 2 to 10 year storms for people who are aware of that term. These are design storms where you're going to get moderate flooding, where then in a 100-year storm, you're going to get what we call riverine flooding. And then, of course, sea level rise and storm surge. The reason that we did include this too is that there is, while it's a targeted vulnerability at the bottom of 4 Mile Run, what is also predicted in climate change is that there are going to be more intense hurricanes. They are probably going to be more likely to move up the Atlantic coastline, and there's a greater propensity being predicted for those, instead of kind of going slightly offshore up the eastern seaboard, that they would actually come further inland. So we could have a situation where you have such huge intense storms. I don't know if everybody remembers Ian from a couple of years ago in Florida, where once you looked at the weather station, the size of that hurricane literally took up the entire length of Florida. So if you have a storm like that, you have a storm that's going to be dumping enormous amounts of water in your watersheds in the northern section of the county. At the same time, particularly if it's really hugging closely inland, it's going to be pushing enormous amounts of water, coupled with storm surge up 4 Mile Run. So you could have that flooding that you saw in that first video coming downstream, running into that storm surge that's being pushed upstream. So the ramp at a glance, the final document suite, there's an executive summary that's around 35, 38 pages long. All of these have been, well, the executive summary has been certainly written with an eye towards communicating with the board, the public at large. The full report is a little bit more technical. That's almost 100 pages long. The appendices report, this volume is over 600 pages long. It covers all the technical memoranda that you see to the right. And again, for those of you who are really geeky on this and very interested and have significant time on your hands, but there are some, you don't have to read all of them, but you may be interested in the climate projections and scenarios, or you may be interested in the market analysis, which we added into the technical side because we wanted the consultant to really look forward facing at how is this going to affect the market, insurance, the cost of debt, bonding, and other impacts. The core ramp elements started with the updated climate projections. From there, we mapped out what we call inundation maps and updated our IDF curves. IDF is your intensity, duration, and frequency of these storms. The the main importance of updating the IDF curves based on these inundation maps is you're really looking at, okay, what do we have to change in the design model for capital projects, both public as well as private sector projects. The vulnerability assessments, which I explained earlier, focusing on your critical civic and civil assets, environmental impacts, and social vulnerability. The social vulnerability piece is unique to the ramp. Generally and customarily, they really go into just what is the impact of a civic or civil impact or a main government facility. Going down or being negatively impacted by flood. We did expand upon the vulnerability assessments to add the environmental impacts and also social vulnerability issues. The risk assessments, which I've told you, for those of you that have the same kind of fascination with it, there are tools, the general costs that are looked at. They're not the only ones because, again, we look at cascading impacts, but the 4 main direct impacts that are calculated into this loss projection is a total loss or replacement of an asset, lost revenue, like you may have from if you have destruction of property, you're not earning tax revenue from those properties, increased costs of O&M, which is going to really go, not exclusively, but it's going to certainly go towards your public assets like streets and sidewalks, and other infrastructure that gets damaged in intense flooding. And of course, the loss of economic activity like you saw in the Westover Commercial District. Capital projects, programs, and policies. So it really covers the gamut to mitigate and manage flooding in Arlington County. Also for the capital projects, there is a cost benefit analysis that is done, again, for conveyance projects or for storage or detention projects. in all the critical watersheds. And then, of course, again, that market impacts and analysis. Liz, I'm glad you're here because there are a couple that I think that you're probably going to be more articulate and maybe more straightforward in explaining what this particular total area flooded by watershed indicates.
Well, I mean, what we did is we calculated inundation areas, and then they calculated the different, you know, the areas that were flooded, and these are the different storms and time horizons that we looked at, and then ranked. We eventually used these to rank some of the, you know, priority locations we'd want to look at. So essentially those inundation maps, and I've shared some of those with some people in this meeting, in some of our public meetings and other discussions. You know, the inundation maps are kind of were critical for the analysis.
And we're going to, speaking of inundation maps, so this is an example of one. What you see on the left is Spout Run, present day and a 10-year storm, and you can see where your inundation corridors are. And you may say, well, this is really interesting because they look linear. One of the core contributing factors, and I have to say Arlington checks off just about every single core factor, unfortunately, is that Arlington is small, but originally it had around 92 miles of crisscrossing streams and large creeks that networked across the whole county, and they serve collectively as really its flood mitigation and its overland relief system. And what happened in early development starting around 1930 is that Arlington started to get developed. And as it developed, what they did was they just piped these streams, what they call undergrounded them. And they piped them, they put dirt on top of them, but they started developing on top of that. So what you had were these streams. What you can see here in these core linear areas, not surprisingly, follow where you had a main stream. And this was the main flow of water during the flood that now has nowhere to go. And if you look to the right, this is what happens with those inundation maps if you look at 2070 and a 500-year storm. And you can see the flooding area not only expands, but it certainly deepens in the intensity of the flooded area and the depths. So these are the updated IDF curve projections, and we're going to be, again, this is an administrative adoption that we're going to be doing shortly now that the ramp is completed, to update it to develop new storm design standards for both private sector and public sector capital programs. The importance of this is I just want to point out that if you look at this kind of second group of orange and gray bars, if you look down at that, it says future RCP. Remember, that's, you know, they follow, it's a 4.0, 6.0, and an 8.5, 4.0 being the most optimistic. Don't worry, there's nothing to see here, folks. Climate change is going to, you know, be righted with everything that we're doing presently. 6 is a middle, and there were some voices who wanted us to adopt the 6. We did take 8.5, which regrettably, even in the last 4 years, has proved to be more likely the case. But if you look at 6.0 and you take a forcing of the highest level at 90%, those calculations on the IDF curves are almost very, very similar to 8.5 at a moderate forcing. So when we have these IDF curves come out, we were confident that we had chosen something that actually was going to be probably something more accurate to what you can predict to occur in the future. I'm not going to go through this, but you're going to get a copy, obviously, or already have a copy of this PowerPoint. These are the main critical facilities that were identified using these future inundation maps and working with all of the departments across the entire county. We had them first proffer a list of their key assets and facilities, and then we kind of really reduced that down because the original list was over 200 sites long that were given to us. Those were just given to us. It wasn't that they were vulnerable, but those were the number of facilities that were, collectively provided by all departments. And from there, mapping those against these IDF curves and future projections, this came up with the main vulnerability assets. This, again, very quickly is a critical facilities cost benefit analysis. And you can see for the most part that when you start talking about flood mitigation, you are coming up with cost and benefit analysis that roughly gets you one-on-one. So you're in, with the exception of the water pollution treatment plant, you're really getting mitigation measures that certainly at the very, very least recoup their cost and their benefits. This is the risk assessments. And just to give you, a very, very quick snapshot into why a risk assessment is so important. Before we did the pivot to flood resilient Arlington, Liz, for the capacity system, the 10-year CIP was what, maybe around 10 to 12 million, all 10 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Early on, with the reaction of the public, certainly to those, 3 years, 2017, 2018, and 2019 of flooding, as well as the early kind of fast track analyses of the ramp. Internally, we looked, and now you'll notice if you look at the 10-year CIP that the capacity system over 10 years collectively is around 200 to 220 million. And this is why. If you look just as Roach's Run, and you go to that far right column, that is the annualized loss of a 100-year storm in 2070, just for Roach's Run. And those are in the millions. So the projected loss again using those tools that were developed by FEMA and others is over $800 million. So you can see the benefit of the investments. And Spout Run is very high. Lubber Run is high as well. These are the ones. Bailey's Branch, we didn't have fully mapped out for a couple of reasons. Part of which is that Bailey's Branch isn't entirely in Arlington as well. But this really goes to show you the benefit, the long-term benefit of making those investments. Again, this is going watershed by watershed, the cost benefit analysis of the recommended projects. And these are projects that were either really driven by the ramp, like you see on the left. This is the Cardinal School vault under construction. And if you look at that picture below it, that's the Cardinal School field today, and underneath it is that vault you see above. And then obviously there was already a program or a plan, rough plan or conceptual plan in place for the Ballston Wetlands Pond, but there was additional analyses that were really informed by the ramp on that project. And again, if you look at that project, this is just the kind of before and after. For those of you who are unaware, this area was really this kind of desolate area on the left was really formed. It was a borrow pit where improvements, I think it was to 66. Wasn't that the
Yeah, it's part of I-66. Yep.
Yep. So improvements to 66 needed to borrow land, and in the construction, this is where they got it from. So this is the wetlands project that we christened last September. The capacity, and again, we're also looking under the ramp to co-site as many, projects as we possibly can, like Cardinal School, where you've got a school site, a location, and you also have a major stormwater facility underneath it. We're also looking to co-purpose projects. So originally the Ballston Wetlands Park was really looked on for our MS4 program and for water quality. But the beauty of this is that I think it's Lubber Run when it overtops in an intense storm. flows first into this, and the Ballston Wetlands Park has the capacity of probably mitigating 25 to 30% of that overtopping currently. Very quickly, these are more inundation maps. You can see this is though what the improvement is projected to be with the conveyance as well as the storage recommended projects. So you can see this 10-year storm at baseline, that's current. So you can see the flooding and then the percentage projected reduction in the flooded area with the conveyance upgrades. This is the same with the storage upgrades, and you can see the reduction in the flooded area there. This is the same type of analysis for conveyance and storage, but on spout run. And there's with the storage projects. And again, I don't want to misinterpret what these recommendations are. This would have been a project that cost around 10 times as much and taken at least 3 times as long if we were going and doing all of the engineering survey studies and all of the feasibility activities that you really do before you go into a project to see if they will work. And this, for example, is a map. Whoops, sorry, I skipped. This is a map in detail. If you're wondering, well, how did they calculate this? This is really all of the individual recommended conveyance projects for spout run. And these are possible recommended storage concepts. Again, we tried to look at one of these, and while there was technical feasibility, there was very, very exceptional costs in one area, but the impacts of the construction and other factors made this a little tough to really pass the total feasibility test. This, again, I'm not going to read through this, but again, for those of you that are interested in going further in depth, these are examples of the programmatic and policy recommendations. You can see that one of them, the voluntary property acquisition approved by the board 3 years ago, has already been in action, adopted or greenlit by the board, and we've been doing that. Floodproofing and technical assistance. We are improving and expanding our real-time rainfall and stream gauges. And all of these are either, activities that are already taking place or initiatives that are already being worked on. Our internal and our public engagement. You can see the working group that was internally formed. You can see some, but not all of the major organizations that we've been working with, primarily with the Civic Federation. The Civic Federation really came forward very, very early on and under its umbrella as really the federation of all of Arlington civic associations. It assigned and there was a group that came together under the CIFED led by John Ford, who I think is still on the line, and they were the Stormwater Executive Committee. And they have been, I would say that we've been meeting with this committee on average or roughly 4 to 6 times every year. We have been making periodic presentations to the CIFED at their monthly meetings. But the executive group has really been informing, challenging, questioning, and tracking the RIP, as well as a lot of other actions that they put forth in resolutions, 2 separate resolutions that they adopted and that we've been implementing. Ramp present and future uses. The good news about this is that the ramp has actually been, as I've noted several times already, it has informed actions. It has given us the data that we need. It has informed capital, CIP development and focus. So it is already being used. Most recently, there was some flooding issues. There were floodplain questions, and there were even some kind of slides and disruption in the Barcroft area. They called up Liz as the floodplain administrator. for the county. And she immediately referred to the ramp and was able to give them almost in real time detailed data and information and projections on that particular area. So what is it also spinning off? The ramp is going to continue to generate projects, programs, and policies, but it's also going to spin off a couple of other main design studies. One that we're scoping out right now is the Flood Resilient Design and Construction Guidelines Manual. This, not surprisingly, is going to recommend, and it may be that we come back at the end and say, we'd like to take this to CPHD and codes and building codes and zoning codes and really talk to them about adopting measures and changes to their codes that reflect this. But not surprisingly, flood resilient design and construction standards typically adopt a lot of the core recommendations or mandates of the FEMA floodplains. So instead of dealing with a base elevation, you're dealing with a flood baseline elevation, or it may require that in flood vulnerable areas that subgrade systems and areas. A lot of people have basements here that also house their main heating and HVAC systems. So it may require that in new builds, those systems are somehow hardened or sheathed from flooding. So we have the ramp. Unfortunately, to the right, there's the energy assurance plan. I don't think this got the attention that it should have. This was completed in February of 2022. The Energy Committee and Tim Effio had really informed this plan quite heavily. So that has been completed. And then obviously in the future, we're going to look at, everyone's looking at urban heat islands, we think, for obvious reasons, but we're also really expanding this to look at urban metabolism and heat management. And that is really going to start with a lot of existing plans as a matrix of what goes into urban metabolism and managing future heat, and then the future programs, policies, and projects that we have to implement in order to make this a thriving community that isn't vulnerable to the social, even the infrastructure, which is greatly affected by heat, but certainly the public health and safety of our population. And that is it for this very, very quick review. So I don't know if there are any core questions that anybody would like to pose. Certainly we're available if people look at this material afterwards to answer any questions that may come to you in the future.
Thank
And
you.
we are going to be doing more presentations on this and maybe a workshop or two.
Thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation. I can see all of the work that went into it, and it's great to have all that data to feel that staff, as you said, this is going to be administratively adopted, and it's very impressive. But questions? I know, Mark, you've been very involved in this.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the things you mentioned, Demetra, was assessing social vulnerability at one point. How do you, what's the thinking about how you assess that and measure something like that? What are the metrics, if there are?
Well, there are a couple. So it's a great question. When you go into disadvantaged communities, if you're talking about social vulnerability, you're talking about generally older buildings. They were built well before, if you look at, for example, Barcroft, the building on that started in the early 1930s. So a lot of those buildings predate any reasonable or effective building codes, and they definitely predate stormwater codes. So you have to look at the heightened vulnerability of those buildings. You have to look at the far reduced ability of those buildings to withstand flooding and what the higher impacts of flooding are in those buildings, and the greater possibility of displacement, for example, as a result of that. Which obviously with disadvantaged communities, you're talking about communities that are going to be the hardest affected in a number of areas and the least resourced in order to deal with them. So we can get further into an explanation of that, Mark, but those are just off the top of my head, some of the factors that go into that social vulnerability. It's not unusual in any community for low income and disadvantaged areas to have building structures that are similar in age, composition, and vulnerability, just general vulnerability as a result of their age and their construction.
Becky Jones first.
Yeah, just could you go into a little bit more detail in terms of conveyance and storage? Specifically what things are involved in conveyance. I assume with some degree of making pipes larger and maybe overland relief. Storage might be a little bit more straightforward. But also to what extent you look at combining those two strategies to terms to kind of maximize flood resilience.
It's an excellent question, and you should have the most excellent person present to answer it. So I'm going to ask Liz if she would step in.
Yeah. Well, for conveyance, it's mostly it's in larger culverts, larger pipes, but it does and the inundation areas help us determine overland flow paths. So the conveyance has to do with moving the water through the system and providing sufficient capacity or space to allow that to happen. The storage is typically any kind of storage, but it can be above ground or below ground. In Arlington, most of it's probably going to end up below ground because we have so few places like the Ballston wetlands and there's Sparrow Pond. There's very few places where we actually have ponds to store the water. And we did not do a combined storage and conveyance. And that's going to be something that, we do as part of the feasibility of specific, as opposed to just the global kind of projects, more when you do the specific feasibility.
And Liz, do you want to address overland relief too? I think Joan added that, and that has a specific clause and a specific, purpose and application as well.
Well, the overland, relief, whenever you can't provide the conveyance, you have to provide the overland relief. And so again, the inundation maps were very essential in that analysis. Because regardless of how big of a pipe system or conveyance system that's underground, or even above ground with open channels, such as stream valleys or streams, you still are going to get the water goes there because of the topography typically. And so where's the water going to go? So that's where the inundation maps are kind of integral into that. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that helps. Thank you.
And Joan, I think we're also going to be looking at what are the opportunities and maximizing the opportunities and redevelopment, say like in Plan Langston Boulevard, particularly since those are higher ridges that flow down into a couple of core watersheds, and what we might be able to gain there in the redevelopment. It's going to be a negotiation because again, really commercial development is meeting what the current code requires it to meet. So obviously we'd love to enhance that ability to store, develop, wider setbacks, more green infrastructure to really add to the built infrastructure too. So hopefully we'll have that ability.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that specific projects still need to have a feasibility. So, you can say that we need a storage of a certain size in, say, Spout Run or Lubber Run or somewhere. And then, we can show graphically on the map where we think the storage should go to help mitigate the flooding. But we have to be able to actually find places big enough that we could do that. And same thing with the conveyance. The the conveyance options, which would be, yes, we can it's one thing to draw a line on a map and consider the length and the diameters and how much it's going to cost, but we still have to physically be able to fit that in the available space that we have. And so there are individual feasibilities that are part of that. And, we've been working on some watershed scale projects in that regard, so that we can, because when you get down into the weeds, finding the making sure you can actually build it and then getting all the components in place and necessary to do that, is certainly one of the challenges that we're still working through. But one of the main things, again, that was helpful to me in these studies is the inundation maps have been very helpful. And also the idea that if you don't do anything, these losses aren't going to go away. They're only going to get worse. And they continually get worse and worse and worse as you take longer and longer to do things or don't do them at all.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Rob?
Yeah, sure. And maybe my question will segue into our next section here. I'm all for risk-informed budgeting and project development here. So it seems like I thought I heard you mention that this planning and this analysis has helped identify capital improvement projects, both increase the budget and help prioritize those. So is that continuing to happen? Will we see that as we present the CIP here, as we learn about it in this next section, that which projects we're doing, as you noted, has to be feasible as well, but all going to be informed, and that we've seen major and have justified major budget increases for this, for some of these water management projects or management projects through this analysis, and we've seen increases in the SIP budget for this?
I would say yes. And Liz, disagree or add on, but, every 2 years, as there's a review of the CIP, so it's updated. And there's a fluid and kind of flexible nature to this. For example, there's a question of vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities like we're seeing down in Barcroft, and of course a very critical area on Columbia Pike and Greenbrier, coupled with opportunity. And really opportunity is defined and it's timed or scheduled by when everything comes together. Like Liz said, there's a great deal of feasibility, and it can be something as well. We need easements, and because we have to acquire and negotiate easements from private property owners, and that's residences and businesses, that may take a long time if you have to get 8 easements and 3 are holdouts. So you're going to see the flux and the ability of the CIP. I haven't heard any reduction. I think that, to be honest with you, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a little bit easier than, say, the air teams, capital projects, because before, it's amazing how many people didn't realize that they were actually paying a tax for their stormwater program. Because it was kind of masked a little bit and collected in a property tax line item on their property tax, so they didn't realize it was there. But now that we're a stormwater utility, it's really an enterprise fund. So it pays for itself. It doesn't add to the debt service or affect the rating of the county's bonding, because you basically schedule your cash flow and your capital cash flow according to the combination of the cost and the debt service. So right now we're really moving along, and we've paced ourselves from the first stab at this higher budget, which was initiated over 3 years ago. I think this will be the 4th year. We're actually on track, but you may see some modifications to see to see Roaches run and Doctors run inserted also into the CIP. But again, when you have like a guaranteed fund from either fees or a tax coming in, it's a little bit different than a capital program that has to be funded out of the general fund.
I think we have time for one more question. David?
Yeah, to what degree is the environmental capital, if you will, taken into consideration in looking at various kinds of remediation plans and so on? And so much of the risk is typically associated with the built infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But trying to remediate the risk for the built infrastructure, oftentimes there are serious implications for the environmental capital that's invested in whether stream beds or ponds or floodplains or the redirection of those waters. So what are the kind of metrics that you use for evaluating the impact on the environmental capital for in a sort of a broad way when developing projects or when trying to select particular strategies for particular remediation questions?
It depends on what you're talking about. So, I'm not saying that it's a hard, fast division, but if you're talking about runoff and if you're talking about water quality, clearly green infrastructure, factors and looms very, very heavily in achieving those goals and those objectives. When you're talking about flooding, particularly in flood vulnerable areas, where you could see in particular areas in the July 2019 storm, we saw flood levels rise in targeted areas, particularly low points of vulnerable corridors, where the water went up sometimes 10 to 11 feet above its normal level, and it did that in less than an hour. So with that kind of flooding, and on NOAA calculated the amount of water that fell on Arlington County, and it fell mostly in Northern County. What you saw again in 4 Mile Run was just that overflow coming down through the major 4 Mile Run channel corridor. When you're talking about that kind of volume and that short amount of time, the velocity and energy of that water is overwhelming. It went through Lubber Run Park and wiped out in less than a half hour 3 bridges. So
that
green infrastructure has a role, but it's not going to mitigate that flooding.
Can I add something to that? When we talk about the area, when we ranked some of the watersheds based on the area of flooded land, that includes, the parks and the RPAs and the stream valleys that might not have any buildings in it in some cases. And then we did include the RPAs and other environmental factors as receptors for the flooding, and they were considered, that is part of the way the analysis was completed.
As well as the streams and erosion. I see what you're saying. You're talking about the impact on our natural resources.
Yeah, but we specifically addressed environmental resources like RPAs and streams as receptors for the flooding that we analyzed.
That's an RPA.
Riparian protection.
Okay, riparian protection area. Thank you so much, Liz, and everyone who worked on this. That was really helpful and fascinating. So we appreciate getting to being one of the first to have this presentation.
Can we get a copy of the full study?
Oh yeah, okay, very quickly. So probably by the end of this week, what we had done is we've been working on a ramp website that comes with a story map. That is going to be completed by Friday. So when we launch that, we're also going to attach all of the executive summary, the full report, and the appendices with all the technical memorandum.
So, but all right, well, we'll look forward to that. As we said earlier, if Jen's right, we're not doing it.
So we're doing the CIP, the CNTMP is next.
Oh, so we are doing CIP. I don't think we have time.
I think it was the only time before the board meets, right, in June.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna have to have a letter. So, if we have an overview, they haven't actually CIP yet. It's not gonna be till I think next week, but whatever we can get would be helpful.
And then next.
I'm laughing this kind of gallows humor just because the CIP has literally been a moving target bouncing all over the place. Every 24 hours, we're having to run new scenarios. So anything that we would be able to give you, which we're not able to, would possibly change in 48 hours. I think we're waiting to get an actual timeline when we can start sharing, Joan. So we will. I just at this point, I don't know what it is because they've altered the timeline.
Yeah, just, it was supposed to be tomorrow, but I think they bumped it up till next week. Is what they said at the county board meeting, I think.
So perhaps this is something that, Demetra, as you get information, when you are able to share information, we can share it by email so that we don't wait until our next meeting.
Yeah, I'm going to alert a couple of people in stormwater as well as, Jenna, to get with you on that. I just want to say that I am next week going to be on a real vacation, the first one I've taken since I got here, and I'm going to be out of pocket, but we'll definitely have people waiting and watching, and we'll distribute or give a link to the proposed CIP as soon as it's available.
Yeah, and
Yes.
just to raise for everybody's awareness, go back and look at the letter that we did 2 years ago when this came before us. Transparency was probably the top issue, the same issue we had with the budget of not knowing enough detail on the projects to know and understand how it advanced. The CEP and other climate agendas. And again, I think, opportunity to think more about embodied carbon. A lot of those expenditures are like road construction, uses a lot of concrete, so. But I
And we
think
know that
that's
we can.
it's kind of some of the key areas of what are the projects, what are the facilities, are they using this as an opportunity to replace HVAC systems with high efficiency electric versions, phase out fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Those types of questions are ones that, constantly are gonna.
I'm sure that letter's on our website, but do you know, I bet you could find it sooner than the rest of us and send it around.
Okay.
And Joan, if you're looking at the CIP, if you're looking at the sidewalk program, I believe, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's under the utilities CIP.
It should be, it's paving and streets, something like that. Or transportation even, but it's not stormwater, obviously.
No, but I always hear Mike Collins speaking to the sidewalk program, and that's utilities.
Utilities, I thought was just water and sanitary, but yeah.
So did I, but I'm just saying, obviously focusing on where the high intensive use of concrete is.
Well, there's no doubt about that being sidewalks, yes.
But again, a lot of those issues in terms of, what they're doing, what the procurement policy is, and we don't have a good insight into that. And making a commitment to make sure that this is in fact low concrete, and are we thinking about climate and environmental issues?
Right, and it's great to hear, we heard about getting low concrete earlier and 20% savings without even extra cost. We talked about resilience in both of these last few presentations. It's great to see the echoes of all of these things because we have such disparate issues, but there are some through lines which are great to hear.
Would it be useful to have folks in some of the subject matter areas be ready to sort of focus on the CIP as soon as we see something and offer some thoughts to the group as part of the network? Because it strikes me that, there's certain things that some of us have worked on and could do something targeted.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so good, step forward now, kind of figure, kind of do a divide and conquer.
Right.
And how we want to do that and some discussions.
That's one of the things I wanted to talk about, really is how to approach these things directly. So look at item 6, the April summary that Jenna sent around. I'd like to not spend time at these meetings going through the minutes of the last meeting. So, and we'd gotten them earlier, but I know I suggested changes and I see Rob putting changes. Let's just do them online if you have changes. If you don't, or if you don't care, that's okay too. But we're not gonna put them on the screen and go through them. Okay, okay with everybody. Okay, so we won't, since these went out and get changes, we won't declare them approved at this meeting. We'll declare them at next meeting, but you get your changes into the next week. And I can send out a note about that. So we're not gonna talk about that. So in terms of updates and discussion, I know there are a number of them. I know Joan testified before the board on solid waste, and I know Doug has some things from the Energy Committee. I know we should talk about virtual meetings, but I also wanted to talk about really the issue that Mark is raising, which is we have a lot of subject matter experts here. And how do we deploy these so that not all of us try to review everything? We've started that with the green building incentive plan because we have a group of 3, Mark, David, Rob, all sitting together. That's very nice of you guys to get to work with that with probably people from the Energy Committee who aren't on this body, so that we run into fewer issues with having, a mini committee meeting to work on the green building policy so bringing people together to work on the areas that they know is something I'd like to be able to do. We all want to focus, but again, as we were saying, we have a huge scope. So trying to find ways to do that. So Mark, I'm going to guess you were just raising your hand, say capital improvement plan, capital, whatever it is, CIP, that you could do the stormwater parts.
Yep.
And I think you guys together could probably think about whatever you're doing with green building, if there are things that are directly, I don't know, Kevin, if you're doing, electric vehicle, all of that. So I know the Energy Committee chair and vice chair at least will be set for that. So we'll know more when we see it. But I really like the approach that you're suggesting, Mark. I think it's just what we're going to have to do because we have a lot. On the bright side, the SPRC process with the high interest rates, I don't know if you're seeing this, Kate, but construction in Arlington is slowed down, and we're not having at every meeting discussing individual site plans. And that's giving us more time to do other stuff. But I still think we have a lot to do, and breaking it out by subject matter expertise would be great. Any comments on that or thoughts about that?
Hey, Cindy, I just want to say, because I'm going to be out next week, that if there are questions from C2E2, if you can collect them all together, I think a lot, I would say probably 90% of the questions that you may have are going to deal with divisions and bureaus inside DES. So Jenna can be a real, clearinghouse for getting those questions to the right people and getting you all the answers back.
That's great. And Demetra, we want you to take your vacation because, you haven't. So, and yeah, there are other people, not just you're not indispensable because I know you are, but there are other people. So we will.
No, I've got a couple of great teams. So take advantage of the incredible talent there. So.
Okay, so we will work on that. So.
Cindy, can I say one thing about doing stuff by email?
Yeah.
It's okay to send stuff to staff asking questions. We really should not have email discussion amongst the committee because we run afoul of state meeting laws. So we really shouldn't be commenting on each other's questions.
As long as it's not everybody's responding and talking at the same time, they give a pass. So if there's a draft or if somebody's got some questions or comments and somebody piles on, I mean, none of us are all checking our emails all the time. And so, we're not going to be, so that is one area that's kind of gone through the courts, and it is okay. I mean, frankly, there is so much to do and these issues are so complicated. They can't be done. They shouldn't be done by one person, and as many as the commissioners that can and want to play in should engage in conversations beforehand. So that when we get to the meeting, we can really kind of focus on any key.
So changes that, and that includes the crosstalk amongst the members?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a pretty big change, I think, from.
No, that was even when I came onto the commission.
Was it?
That there was discussion on that. The rule is it gets in, and when it's in person, you can't have more than 2 commissioners.
And that would be phone, that'd be in person. Yeah. So the 3 of you will. Yeah. And I think to John's point that if you were all in a Google Doc at the same time, it's the synchronicity of it. If everybody goes in and does their own email or their own comments on their own time and then responds, that's okay.
So in person and phone are on one side of the line, but emails, which are not simultaneous, are on the other side of the line.
That is our understanding.
I can check on it.
Okay. So, thank you for that, Kevin.
My information was old because we used to struggle with some of the questions I,
Yeah.
but, so.
It is spoiled.
It is foible, that's right, your person, I think I sent an email around that, about that. That, you know, if you're using your personal email or your business, whatever email you're using, it could be discoverable if somebody asked for it, emails from commissioners on the solid waste management plan. Even though it's your personal email, I mean, I can't get all of your personal emails, but your personal emails.
Which actually in some ways, using Google Docs makes things a lot easier because if you've got everything consolidated in the version history of a Google Doc, you've got that right there.
Right,
So,
you're not having to search your own emails to try to.
again, I'm not aware of really
Yeah, this
FOIA requests.
doesn't happen.
Not that I don't care.
Hopefully, you know, yeah,
It's boring.
it's exactly, it's hard enough for us to read it. Who else wants it? So, well, we are going to, so anything else in the CIPs? Now that we have a plan, we don't have anything to talk about yet, but we will be ready when we have it. Okay, Joan, you want to report on the solid waste management plan, or you sent an email around? Do you feel like that is? Sent to
Well, I
everybody?
did send, I'll summarize the notes. I can send that to the commission, but, county board had some discussion on it. General sense that, you know, the county, again, they picked up on a lot of the points that we made in our letter about, you know, seeing the county and APS leading more by example. Much more interest in focusing on reduction over recycling right. Discussion about just, you know, some of this is, you know, thinking about ways of making it convenient for people because especially, I mean, Maureen talked about living in an apartment and every time you add something that's an extra 10 or 20 minutes, then it makes it harder for people to want to do the right thing. So I think there was, and the other thing that came up by a couple is construction and demolition material. Talked about that a good bit and it came up with Susan mentioned it as well. And also just actually making sure they get something in there that indicates that there's a climate impact to our waste streams and recognizing the carbon emissions and to support the idea that we really need to focus much more on reduction. So can say everybody's welcome to send the county board their own personal comments as well. They'll be looking at it over the next month. I'm not sure we're going to see a huge number of changes. Again, they've part of the first whole part of it is what's required by the state, which is really kind of wonky about, you know, what their projections for trash and how they're going to manage it, how they're going to make their 25% recycling requirement, which the county, at least in theory, surpasses that by a good margin. So I think, you know, it's again, another opportunities is the county board gets into, they've talked about a climate resolution. So, you know, making sure that as part of that climate resolution, there's a recognition that, you know, what we consume and what we throw away is actually part of our climate impact and should be something that the county is prioritized and focused on.
Thank you for testifying. It's been your Saturday. Appreciate
Well,
it.
you get a chance to do it next month.
I don't know. I am going to Europe. Energy committee, Doug and Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I'll give a little report with two main items. So at our last meeting, one of the things that we talked about was outreach. You know, we're all members of our community and it's fun to monitor what the staff is doing and to give suggestions as to what the staff should do. But that's only really a part of the effort to bring the message of the threat of climate change and the need to adapt and to reduce emissions to the community. And we're all community leaders and community influencers in our own way. So I think we all need to do what we can to get the word out. So as part of that, one of the things that the county board did on Saturday was to give final approval to the ordinance that allows real estate exemption for solar energy equipment on buildings, mostly single family houses, but other larger buildings too. And so the county building officer is prepared to accept the applications for the exemption. It's a one-page form, and I don't have solar panels on my house yet. But if anybody does, or if you know anybody that does, please get the word out. I can pass this form out. It's very simple. You just attach the documents that when you had the installation, and it shows the cost, and then you get an exemption of that amount from your real estate taxes.
Send a link for that form.
I can, I will. And so please get the word out to any organizations or groups that are part of, or anybody that you know. I'm sure the county will make this prominent on the website soon. But I think this is an excellent thing that the has done. And it shows that the county is really in favor of renewable energy on a single building basis.
So Doug, how's the exemption work? It just reduces your.
Right, so if, for example, you had a $30,000 installation, I'm out of the air, and because our real estate tax rate is currently just a hair over 1%, that would be a $300 reduction in your property taxes, and that would be each year for 5 years. So you just have to submit the form one time, and you get that reduction in your taxes for 5 years. So that's not a ton of money, but it's not nothing either. So, and all you have to do is submit the form with a couple of documents attached. So I would hope that anybody who has solar panels would do that, or if you know anybody, please make sure they're aware of this opportunity.
If that form is online, and can you fill it out electronically online?
Well, maybe it should be.
Do you need a wet signature?
Oh, so I don't know about submitting it, but your question was about how to get it, right?
Both, yeah.
Okay. So it's been circulated to the members of the Energy Committee. I presume it was also circulated to the members of the commission. But it should also be like available somewhere on the county website soon.
Had to get off.
Yeah,
Okay.
Jenna, could you maybe?
Oh, yeah, I'll check with Rich.
I've got ways of getting that type of information out.
Okay.
Which,
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Jen, it was just adopted on Saturday, so I think if we add it to the AIR website,
Yeah,
then the form can be added to that.
okay.
Hi, everybody. Real briefly, I'll jump in. This is Rich Dooley with the AIR team. Real estate assessment, I've been keeping track of this, working together with the chief building official for the county last week, and real estate assessment will have up on their website the information for this whole process, including an email address that is available to go ahead and to email information to. So that information will be up there, and as of this afternoon, they were still working on the text and the verbiage on the website and so forth. So it's not ready for prime time yet, but it is in process, and I'm encouraged by that, given the timing. As Dimitri had mentioned, since it was approved on Saturday, this is relative light speed.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rich, if you can go ahead and let us know when that's all up, and it would be great if it's on the AIR website as well. Should be something that, as we're promoting the solar co-op, that we're mentioning that as well.
Sure, I'll coordinate with Jenna and make sure that links are being made and so forth.
Can you get so this is tax year, so can you get it for the calendar year 2024 now if you apply this year? So you'll see the reduction. When do tax get drawn in June and
October.
June and October, right? Is that when so you'll have a full reduction in your October bill if you submit it by a certain date that they put on the website?
So I would advocate for anything like this that you check with your tax preparer and tax consultants.
Or
You're entitled to it.
Out of curiosity, how did you land on 5 years as the right time?
think that's what the previous ordinance had, but the previous ordinance was not effective. And I'm not sure if it might actually be in the state law that permits this. But I'd have to look that up.
But you didn't develop the 5 years.
I didn't.
So I guess, yeah, where did it come from? I guess is my point. Yeah.
It's been on the books for quite some time. It's just that it wasn't being
Nobody knew about it.
executed or enforced until Doug kind of took this
I
on.
see.
So
And then the whole process was OBE because the state changed and how they.
Okay,
Yeah.
So.
let's take this part
So
off.
the other issue that we're working on in the Energy Committee, and this isn't nearly as fully developed, but it's kind of the outreach thing, is we're thinking about the possibility of putting together a draft letter that might eventually come to this committee to go to urge APS to increase the extent to which climate change is taught in APS curriculum. And that's a broad subject. I'm aware that this has been broached by C2E2 or EC in the past years. I don't know.
Is it part of the SOL? Science?
I don't think so.
There's a little.
You got a great, the Energy
The last
Committee.
Months doing nothing but SOL review.
The Energy Committee got a great presentation from one of the Energy Committee members, Kip Malinowski, who is the IB middle school coordinator or something
Yes,
for science.
yes.
And he said it wasn't part of SOL, but he really went through every grade, 12, I think, showing what you had to learn and what was part of it. And it wasn't that much. So
Shocking to me how little it was. Like almost outrageous, but I'm trying not to get too fired up.
So more to come on that. Any other? I do have one issue if we have time, but are there any other reports? Thank you, Mark, for all the SPRC things. You're keeping track of it. Thank goodness it's quiet. You saw that there's, I mean, you may or may not have seen, but I emailed around that there's this new possibility that we can, and it's great to see this great turnout. Thank you, everyone here. And thank you, Joe. I know you're sick. But it's great to see so many people in the room. But we now have the option, which we didn't have before, to meet virtually more often. And basically it comes out to, we could meet virtually, I think, every other month. And yeah, instead of coming in, and then you can't do 2 in a row. So that's an issue. We meet 11 times.
Winter months, is that
Yeah.
cold and dark and.
Right. Yeah, can't do 2 in a row. So we have to pick our winter months, but I don't know what I don't know how people think about it, how difficult it is to get here. Doug?
I'll give my 2 cents, which may not be popular, but whatever. I think it's so much more productive to be around the table in person. I love Zoom. I was doing Zoom before the pandemic. I spend hours on Zoom every day with classes and meetings and stuff. But I just think it's so much more productive. You can look somebody in the eye. You get a much quicker response. You don't have to put your virtual hand up to talk. So I just think it's so much more productive to meet in person and sit around a table.
We have virtual meetings now, I think, twice out of them. Is that right, John?
3 times.
3 times. So we'd have 2 more. Elizabeth?
I agree with that sentiment. Also selfishly, it's harder for me to meet virtually at 7 o'clock because it's bedtime for my kids. They do not
When
want
you're
me
right
at my
there.
computer.
When you're right there.
But I had a question as well, which is, how does this affect the in-person quorum needed? Or is it always that you can have a quorum between in-person and virtual?
Oh, you mean if we were allowed to have a hybrid meeting, if we were allowed to have a virtual meeting, but we chose to have an in-person meeting, could we still count the people who chose to be virtual? I wonder if they've got that far.
I don't think, I think if it's hybrid, although I think they did make a minor change on that if someone.
I'll just double check.
And we'll have to look at the rules specifically, but if someone can't attend because of a disability or because they're a caretaker for somebody that's, got a disability or a medical issue, will want to be, then they can count towards the quorum.
Which suggests that if that isn't the case, then they can't count.
Yeah, yeah. And again, the rules still apply for, you can only attend.
In that case, sorry to interrupt. in that case, I wonder if it might be wise to kind of save those meetings, or if we can anticipate that there's not going to be business to vote on, or if that there's not going to be a quorum anyway, that we could maybe utilize the virtual meeting for that purpose as opposed to selecting a specific month.
Yeah, you do have to, can't have 2 in a row that are virtual. But that's an interesting idea. Maybe we play it by ear a little bit. Right now, we meet 11 times a year. We don't meet in August. And I thought it was 2, but I guess it's 3 virtual meetings.
Yeah.
One of them is, you remember what they
I
are?
think one's coming up in July, and then there's one like in October, and it might be November.
About adding one more in the winter months if we can.
Yeah, I think,
I
like Michaela's idea of,
winter months.
Yeah.
yeah,
This is
let's see what we have. Virtual. Is there one higher up if you scroll up?
Especially after that.
So it's February, July, and November. Okay, well, so June will be in person, July will be virtual, August won't happen, and we'll figure it out somewhere before September.
But December?
I think I decided in November, so we can't do both.
Have to pick.
Yeah.
September.
Yeah,
Or maybe October and December. So
yeah,
that we're-
December seems like a time when a lot of people might be traveling. Okay.
That's my birthday, so I can verify. Everyone's traveling on that day. Always.
Can I just point out one thing? I
Yeah.
sort of agree with Doug, but also walking the walk and talking the talk. There is a carbon footprint to driving into the meeting here, which don't have with virtual.
Well, you gotta take public.
Not everybody here.
Driver fancy.
I don't want to do in February.
And Jenna just she never left, so that.
Yeah, I like the in-person. I do think you get a little bit more engagement, but virtual is nice occasionally, just so you don't have that transportation issue. One thing is that they actually have set some somewhat strange rules, is that you have to have the camera on.
Oh, right, that's weird. If we have a virtual meeting for your attendance count, you have to keep the camera on all the time.
I think it may.
Members of the public can see you.
Kids will attend.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The problem is the way.
It wasn't true. It's a new.
Interesting though, if there's a presentation.
Yeah, and the way Microsoft does it, even if you have your camera on, it may not actually be showing you on the screen.
Right, well, that's the
So,
best part. You have to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah.
You can turn it on and put it at the wall.
Yeah. So I think, the staff was gonna look at, because there were questions at the meeting about that. And so staff was gonna look into that, because technically, actually, you can have your camera on, but if you can't be seen, then you're kind of violating the intent.
I have to rethink my position on that, because in any meeting when there's something on the screen, I have to like put my face on the screen.
Will not see you in June because I'm going to be in Europe, but we had a
Thank you,
virtual
everyone.
meeting. Thank you, Demetra, for your presentation. Thank you, Joe. And thank you.
Oh, can I just add real quick that we received final authorization, I mean, Rich was dogging them from DOE, so we now have authority to launch our e-bike rebate program. And we're gonna take that to the board in June, and we're also waiting to get the final green light and all the formal documentation from EPA on our G2G grant, so.
Additional 5%. Yes. Yeah.
If I don't touch you, have a great vacation. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't think that's gonna push people to silence, but it is.
Yes.